The U.S. elite and the U.S. masses. We the people. Let's go back and talk about who lived in early America to give us some sort of background for what was going on at the time that the Founding Fathers created the Constitution. We're going to be studying the Constitution as the backbone of our American government, and so it's important to figure out where those rules and those institutions came from. In early America, there were 4 different groups of people. There were indentured servants, slaves, and Native Americans, who really didn't own anything in society. There were freeholders, who were small farmers who worked their own land, and fishermen, dockhands, lumber workers, sailors, and merchants, slightly above the indentured servants in the societal system. Then we had a group called the Middlers. The Middlers were more like business people. They had successful farms, they were shopkeepers, and they were independent artisans. And then lastly, there were the elite group, which we'll be talking about at length in this next section. Of these 4 different groups, the Middlers and the elite were a very small portion, and the red bar between the 2 sections indicates the vast divide between the 2. There were indentured servants, slaves, and Native Americans, and freeholders, and then there was a very, very large gap before you got to the group of Middlers and then you got to the elites. Alexander Hamilton, one of the very famous writers of this period and who was quite involved in early government during this time in this country, wrote that all communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born, and the other are the masses of people. In this diagram, we can see that of the 4 million people who inhabited the area around this time, the vast majority of them were freeholders. That looks like about 50% were freeholders. Then you had about a quarter who were indentured servants, and about a quarter who were slaves. You can see the smaller piece of the pie there, the purple one, which is Middlers, and then you can see the very tiny slice, who were the elites. Now you can understand Alexander Hamilton's quote where he says that the community is divided into the few and the many. The 3 groups that we talked about in the previous slide, where you had the indentured servants, slaves, and freeholders, take up the vast majority of this pie graph. They are the many. And the few, the rich and well-born, would be the Middlers and the elites. So who were these masses of individuals? Who were the many? We're talking about 80% of the people who lived during that time. They made their living in dirt. They were farmers, they were traders, and they were people who built up their homes on the frontier and lived that way. Servants and slaves were considered property at that time, so they actually had no farms or any work themselves that they actually could generate income from, because they were property of the people who owned them. Not only the slaves, but the indentured servants as well. Some people could vote, but generally they didn't. They were preoccupied because they either had way too much to do out in the farms and trying to feed their families and survive to get involved in politics, or they were preoccupied with the fact that they had a ton of debt that they had to somehow repay in order to keep on subsisting. A lot of people also lived out in the wilderness. If you've seen the early frontier movies, there was quite a lot of land in between neighbors. It wasn't the situation where you could just drive down to the town hall. Probably going just to the nearest town center would be many miles away that you had to do with either a horse or carriage, a wagon that you had at the time, or on foot. And many people just didn't see the need to make that trip. The elite, on the other hand, were the few, and what isolated them was the wealth that they had. Generally, they were intellectual and economic elites. They were the only ones who would have gone to school at all at this time, and they would have owned pretty much everything that you could see. They would own the estates that everybody else worked on. They would own the banks and the stores that people could shop at if they made it over there. They owned the banks themselves that lended out money. They were financiers, so if you had to buy farm equipment, then you were borrowing money from them. And a lot of them were real estate and land speculators. They would go around buying up land from smaller farms that couldn't afford to run them anymore, and then selling them off at a higher price. So when you couldn't afford to continue your land, they would buy it from you, sell it off to somebody else, or buy it from you and then rent back to you a portion for you to live on. So it wouldn't be your land anymore. They would get the revenues from that land, but you'd be able to stay there for a price. They also owned all of the government bonds at the time. Being a new government, we had to borrow money from somebody, and we borrowed it from the independent wealth that we had among the people who were the elite at the time. And out of this group came the group that we know as the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers and the rest of the elite, and remember we're thinking of that tiny little magenta slice of the population, had very strong opinions of what the government would be, who the winners and the losers should be, and how the government was going to operate when they had such a tiny slice of the few governing the larger piece of the pie, the 80%, which was the many. Alexander Hamilton commented that the people are a great beast, and John Jay, his contemporary, said the people who own the country ought to govern it. Alexander Hamilton again said, the people are turbulent and changing, they seldom judge or determine right. Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison were the three writers of the Federalist Papers, which you may have heard of before. They actually published them under the name Publius, which was a pen name for them, and there was a group of political essays which they gathered together. They would dispute about their ideas of government and about the elites governing of the masses, and so that's where we got these types of quotes from. At the time, the qualifications for voting and holding public office were pretty steep, and this was another barrier to entry for the masses of individuals. We already talked about a lot of reasons why maybe the basic farmer wouldn't vote, but here are a couple other reasons, a couple other things that would make it a little bit more difficult. In order to vote, you needed to be white, you need to be male, and you needed to own property. So as you can see, this already cuts out a good percentage of the population. So we get it that in this case, not female, no women are going to be able to vote. We know that that didn't happen until much, much later. People who were not white were not able to vote, slave or free. Native Americans were not allowed to vote. Indentured servants were not allowed to vote because, of course, they did not own property. If you lost property because it was sold off to a surveyor or someone who was taking it to lend it back to you, then you didn't own property and you weren't able to vote. So you're looking at a lot of the freeholders not being able to vote as well. And actually a lot of white males who maybe even were part of a middle class, but they didn't own enough property, would not be able to vote as well. You had to not only own property, but own a certain amount of property in order to qualify for voting. In terms of public office, you also, in addition to all of these categories, had to be worth a certain amount of money. You had to have a certain amount of wealth. For example, a State Carolina senator had to be worth at least 7,000 pounds. That was about $1 million at the time, clear of debt. So if you weren't extremely wealthy, if you weren't a millionaire, then you could not even put yourself up to run for office for a state senator in South Carolina. The elite group who ran for office and who ran the country at the time really were a group that knew each other very well. Many of them were related. They were either married or they were father and son, uncle and nephew. They generally were business partners if they could work together a lot, and they met with each other quite a bit. They often actually got together as a group, which was interesting because what we learned about the frontier is just how difficult it was to travel around and get together. Well, if you don't have to work, if you're not the type who's having to rake the ground for your subsistence, you had a little bit more time on your hands. And so what they would do is they would get together in large groups and hold a lot of private meetings. And in these meetings, they would talk about business, they would talk about politics, and of course, this is just like inviting over your closest friends and family, except they happen to be all of the wealthy people of the time. Many of them had been participating in government in one way or another long before the Revolutionary War, and had been involved in government even when we had ties with England. And so many of them were ambassadors, or they were dealing with government in some way or another, even before the United States became its own nation. And so they really were familiar with what was going on with this, and they had, a sense of what should be going on in politics and had a plan for what they wanted to have happen. This is one artist's rendition of, and you can recognize in this picture, it looks like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and some other folks here sitting around the table and talking about these things. And you can just imagine over dinner or over their after dinner talks, talking about what they think a government or a constitution or what politics should look like, and planning these things out. They really didn't mince words and take time to talk about things that they believed to be insignificant, but really planned out what they thought the issues of the day were and what should happen. And because all of them would come from a different sphere of influence, they didn't necessarily live next to each other. They would then take these ideas back to their own home areas and be able to implement them in the local governments in the areas that they had. And so really, they were running the country from their dining room table.